Happy weekend, everybody. Welcome to a special bonus edition of the Erin Molan Show. Oh, God, my daughter just fell into a bush, but we are all good. This episode is on the Chinese Communist Party. And, yeah, darling, and the rising threat, even though we know it's a very current and existing threat. It talks not only about what they are doing internally, but in essence, the fact that they are benefiting more than anyone else from the current chaos in the world. This is a real deep dive into how they operate, what they want, Xi Jinping's legacy, and how it ties into the Middle East at the moment. So please enjoy. Andrew Phelan, thank you so very much for your time and for joining me here on the Erin Molan Show.
Great to be with you, Erin. Thanks for having me.
I want to focus on China today because I know it's an area specifically of interest to you. You're an expert. There's no other way to put it. I know you're very, very much engaged in other areas as well, but specifically China now and the US-China relationship, particularly under President Trump. We recently saw a meeting between the two of them. Trump was fairly positive post that meeting. He is generally positive post most meetings, despite what goes on inside. What do you think happened within, and what do you think the impact of that meeting will be moving forward, not just economically, but militarily as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, I have a sort of rule when I'm out having dinner with friends not to mention the C word in front of me, because then I'm off to the races, and you can't shut me up. So, yeah, look, we're living in extraordinary times. So I think October 25, historians will look back on and say this was a key inflection point in what has been building up for 30 years since, it's coming up on 40 years since my first trip to China. And so I was there when US corporations were starting to go in and invest. I have behind me the case study of Beijing Jeep, which was the very first automobile joint venture. I remember one day walking from my office down to the China World, where the guest speaker was the late Ron Brown, who was Bill Clinton's commerce secretary. And on the way down the street, down Zhongguo Menwai to that lunch, I had 4 or 5 people trying to sell me fake copies of Microsoft Windows back then. So and
you're showing your age, Andrew.
Yeah, I sure am. Secretary Brown alluded to that in his speech. IP knockoffs and everything, but it was tolerated. Nobody did anything about it, and this has progressed. Fast forward to where we are today. The US industrial base has been so hollowed out by, getting kit, putting it in containers, shipping it across the Pacific, having 1 or 2 senior managers go. That all happened about 20 years ago. China's now in a position where, it's 35% of world manufacturing. It's the standalone manufacturing juggernaut. All these things tie in together, trade, manufacturing, and the military. And in fact, China has a doctrine, this is not lost on those in Washington, called civil military fusion, Junminronghe, and that's a big part of what they do. So civilian shipbuilding, military shipbuilding, its maritime presence around the world, the merchant marine. We've heard Trump and Rubio talking about the Panama Canal. All those things are intertwined. Now we're in a position where we've got China and the US are really the G2. These are the dominant economic powers in the world. And the US is woken up to this kind of at the 11th hour because we've been distracted by 2 big wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, for the last 20 years. And all the while that was happening, all the while that the US was distracted in those forever wars, China has been planning its strategy to keep America at bay, to annex Taiwan. And so all these things have come to a head right now. So to me, this is the story of our time, daylight second.
I couldn't agree more. And you mentioned this kind of late waking up. Trump was probably the first US leader to really identify China as a threat. Elbridge Colby, someone we both know who was the architect of his national security strategy during the first term, has been all over this issue for a very long time. Is he the president for this moment, do you think? Is he the president capable of handling what is no secret? This is what drives me insane, in that if China were being completely covert over what they wanted, you would understand the world being asleep. They're telling us exactly what they want. They're showing us exactly what they want.
100%. And this is how I ended up being a kind of a media commentator, quite by accident, actually. I had no interest or no ambition in being in journalism or media. It sort of came out of being so disappointed with the lack of in-depth coverage of this stuff, which is completely disproportional to its importance, you know?
Yeah.
And so there's a great documentary you can find on YouTube called The War of the Factories. And so wars are won and lost as much on the factory floor as they are on the battlefield. And China's been able to amass, you know, world leadership in so many areas. And its factories are heavily automated now. I mean, there's something called a dark factory that runs 24/7 that's completely robotized, spitting out electric vehicles. And so and the US is being challenged on a size and scale that's completely unprecedented in human history. And, you know, at the height of the Cold War One, the Soviet Union was never more than 30% of the US economy, whereas some would argue that, you know, China's roughly on parity, which is true. The good news is, as Rush Doshi points out, who is in the Biden administration and is back in at Georgetown now, is that if we work together, the G7, the free world, we outscale China. And so that's the good news. We got to coordinate. So Trump deserves credit. He's the first US president to raise this stuff and say, hey, you know what? Call it as it is. We're going to fight back. He deserves enormous credit for that. And he's shown the lead. Others are now showing signs of following. Merz in Germany, Maloney in Italy, and so on. Here in Australia, I'm not quite sure we're fully on board yet under the current Prime Minister.
That's the understatement of the year.
Sadly, I'm doing what I can to be a pain in the ass on that stuff and get out and preach the gospel. I think the overwhelming majority of people in our country in Australia, well, certainly people over 30, are really aware of how critical our alliance with the US is. It's a bedrock alliance. But we've got our work cut out, and time is of the essence because China, the PRC, I like to call it PRC Inc. PRC Inc. is not taking a holiday. It's not slowing down and waiting for us to catch up. Quite the opposite. It's doubling down in the areas where it's strong. And one of those critical areas, you know, we've heard about rare earths and critical minerals. We've heard about our alliance.
Just on that, Andrew, let me just bring you something I saw this morning on Fox News. They were talking about these issues. China's rare earth dominance, just to give people an idea in general terms, 69% China mining, 12% the US are mining, 90% rare earth dominance, China processing, 1% US processing. That gives you an indication of just how major their stronghold is in this space. And for people who don't know what these are used for, it's, you know, for weapons, for iPhones, for, you know, things that we need and use day to day.
Yeah, well, as you said earlier, you know, this is, we've had this sort of, I guess, strategic myopia and laziness, not paying attention to China. It's not in the news. In-depth stuff is not in the news. It's not very sexy when they do a 5-year strategic plan. I mean, the new one came out a couple of weeks ago after the fourth plenum. That's hardly got any attention. And they're talking about things like the low altitude economy. What's the low altitude economy? That's getting around in air taxis below 3,000 feet. You know, that's an area of focus going forward. And they've got 17 million engineers, and they're all going to work. I remember there was a reconnaissance flight over the South China Sea, and one of the officers of the US Air Force or Navy said, you know, when they were building those islets and in the, you know, turning them into little battle stations in the South China Sea, he said, we're pretty sure they work weekends. Well, to an old China hand like me, when you come out semi-sozzled out of a nightclub at 3 a.m. in Beijing when you're in your 20s, and there's a guy welding on top of a skyscraper at 3 a.m., yeah, they work weekends. And
I mean, even from a like education, sport, like from 3 years old, I mean, they create chaos in Western nations to make young people lazy and woke and you know, gender ideology and the whole thing because it benefits them. 100%. They would never tolerate it of their own people. They 100%. Are focused.
100%. That's why there's no TikTok in China, despite the fact that it's owned by ByteDance. And instead, its sister product, Douyin, is the equivalent. And they don't want their kids out, you know, doing the electric boogaloo. They want them to be studying how to make rockets in their backyard. And they limit the time and all that sort of stuff. So long game. Where's that going to be in a generation from now? You think about it, right? They're churning out all these engineers. Now, woken up to this at the 11th hour, and there's some great work being done. Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China, I think is probably the most important economic book of the last 25 years. Goes into great depth, and the numbers are staggering. When you quote the numbers in China, people go, That can't be right. Well, it is right
Wow.
because it's just, it's 4 times the US population. So we've got another area is pharmaceuticals. Rosemary Gibson wrote China RX in 2018. So there's a bunch of people that have been, trying to sound the alarm and they haven't been getting attention. But the export controls on rare earth magnets, that was a card that China had that they've now played.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, they've been able to hold the US manufacturing sector to ransom. That's now got the attention. So, I mean, Deng Xiaoping, as far back as the 80s, said, the Middle East has got oil, it's well known, China's got rare earths. We didn't pay any attention. In 2010, they weaponized that against the Japanese. That got their attention. And I've got a couple of mates that are very active in that space, trying to drive investment into rare earths and critical minerals. We need to get our mojo back. That's not going to happen overnight because, licensing for mines and everything takes time. Taking the offtake, processing it is going to take time. But we've got to apply our muscle and energy to this urgently. Otherwise, we're in real strife because, as I mentioned before, in a military conflict, you run out of ammo, you're in strife. And China is stockpiling all that stuff and also automating its weapons manufacturing.
Critical mineral deal with Australia are helping in some way, certainly helping the relationship between Albanese and Donald Trump and enabling our Prime Minister to finally get the US President's mobile number, which is a sad state of affairs that it took this long. I want to talk about Taiwan, Andrew. We've had former commanders in the US military say that this could happen prior to 2027. You know better than anyone that Xi Jinping's need to reunite Taiwan with the mainland is only a small part of what he wants to eventually achieve. It's much, much bigger than that. But it's important to him. When does it happen? And does that start World War III? Does the US come in and
when does
defend?
it happen? It's going to happen at high noon tomorrow, Erin. I'm sorry to break the news to you. It could happen at any time. And that's the sense of urgency that we need to be prepared for. And I don't see the South China Sea as being as much of a flashpoint. The Philippines is pretty weak. The ASEAN states are pretty weak. They're easy to bully. But China's not quite ready to fight a big conflict that far away from its shores. Taiwan Strait's a different kettle of fish because you can inundate the area with rockets and missiles. They have sea mines and so forth. It wouldn't be easy because you still got to get across the Taiwan Strait, but they could do an enormous amount of damage. So she wants to do it. China practices for it every single day. And so, the US has been reorienting its force posture, dispersing it, away from Guam and so on, including Northern Australia, Western Australia, which have become critical. And we're great mates with the US, 100%. But the US is also acting in its national interest here in driving that. And if you listen to the likes of Admiral Paparo, the head of Indo-PACOM, he's saying, not having to go through the straits, the Sunda Strait or the Lombok Strait through the Indonesian archipelago to get to theatre is a much more advantageous posture position for the US. And of course, we're now onto the great game because the Big Blue Pacific doesn't get much attention. In fact, when Ambassador Kennedy was going through her Senate confirmation hearings, she was asked if she was up to speed with what was going on in the Pacific. This is after the Solomon Islands signed a security deal with the PRC. And she wasn't. And you can't blame her because who spends time thinking about what's going on in these little countries? But
they need to. And that's the point.
Exactly
the US and its Pacific alliances deserve more attention.
100%. So these little countries are critically important because China, one of the other areas, of course, is shipbuilding. During the Reagan administration, the US was the world's #1 shipbuilder. Today, it's less than 1%. In about 2003, under Zhu Rongji, PRC Inc. said, we're going to go huge into shipbuilding. Back then, South Korea was the dominant player. Today, it wasn't that long ago I was saying China's 40% in new ship tonnage. Today, it's 53%. But more concerning is that the order book for new merchant marine vessels is 65% of the order book. So they are smashing it in shipbuilding. The new Navy Secretary, John Phelan, no relation, although I did have an Uncle Johnny Phelan, but sadly he succumbed to COVID. He's got his work cut out. And once again, you've got to work with allies because the South Koreans, the Japanese are still strong in shipbuilding. India's coming up. India's kind of the joker in the pack. Historically, they've been non-aligned, but they're the most populous country. Their industrial prowess and their military is getting stronger. getting India on side is going to be very important as we look at how all this stuff plays out. But back to the Pacific, I think we forget, say for example, the Battle of Guadalcanal, just to cite one example. A lot of young Americans died there, and they were using World War I era weapons, fighting against Japan, the Japanese infantry, who were thought to be unbeatable. This was after Pearl Harbor. And we've forgotten about them. Their sacrifice. Shame on us, because those young men died far away from home, fighting for the things that we take for granted today. The ability to go into the city and protest or whatever, our free speech, the rule of law. And I guess what we're seeing is, a good friend of mine, Desmond Shum, put it this way. He said the US and China are going through a divorce after 30 years of marriage. It's going to be messy. It's going to be sticky. There's going to be forward steps, backward steps. It's going to be tricky. We're going to have truces in this new Cold War, and so on and so on. But the long-term trend is thus. Both sides are going to separate and decouple. I call it the great bifurcation. Desmond calls it the big divorce. Cleo Pascal says it's like getting a parasite out of you, kind of. And she's got a point, actually. Yeah. You look at where China Inc. does things very differently. They show up in the Pacific. Australians go and do healthcare and policing and that sort of thing. They go and they bribe the corner office. They've just done this in Vanuatu.
Yeah. You can't compete with the kind of money. And just on Ambassador Kennedy, in her defense, part of us being such strong allies, purportedly with the US, is they rely on us to be across this space and the Pacific nations. Yeah. We as Australians, we're right here and we drop the bloody ball. Consecutive governments drop the ball and let China come in entirely. And I know that it's easier said than done, but in many ways we didn't put up a fight for allies that align more with what we stand for than what China does. I know we don't have the coin, but we dropped the ball significantly. Yeah. We let down the US.
Yeah, well, we actually outspend China in the Pacific. But I think the issue is, and this is where I think Trump...
Is that from what you're aware of? I mean, how much are we unaware of?
Well, that's probably a bit hard to... I mean, when I was, for example, working for GE, we had it drummed into us, the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. You don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times for bribing officials in the developing world. China, that's their modus operandi. They think of it as a competitive advantage,
absolutely.
Right? They go in and it's like taking candy from a baby. Would you like a presidential office? We can do that. We'll upgrade the printing press so long as it prints China-friendly stuff. Yeah. So they're going to the Pacific. The Pacific's important, not just because historically, we're saying kind of revisiting the Pacific War and the maps and all that stuff, but also the exclusive economic zones of these little countries are enormous. Like the Marshall Islands is half the size of India. It's got the world's richest tuna fleets and so on. But in a Pacific war, when China's dominating shipping, all of a sudden they're getting all these places on the map. They want to have ports that are initially civilian that are going to become dual use, this sort of thing. So it's game on. Panama Canal is another example of that. The US built it. Carter handed over to the Panamanians. Both ends of the canal had interest from Hutchison, Li Ka-shing, formerly Asia's richest man in Hong Kong. I don't think he's a great fan of the Chinese Communist Party, so he was quite happy to do a deal with BlackRock at very good prices. Now, Beijing's come in and said, not so quickly. We want Costco, one of our two state-owned shipping companies, to have a stake in that deal so we can sit in there and watch what's going on. So.
Can you help us understand, and I know that President Biden was in a million different spaces when it came to this whole strategic ambiguity when it came to Taiwan and what the US's role would be should China invade. Where does America stand now under Donald Trump when it comes to this?
Well, I think Elbridge Colby is 100% of his focus is on that particular flashpoint and preventing it from happening. The idea is, a lot of experts in Washington will say, is that Xi Jinping will get out of bed and go, not today, because they want to make sure that they can win. So it's changing that strategic calculus. We saw a flashpoint of sorts in that the other day when Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, had said, look, for Japan, this is an existential crisis. We knew that already.
Yeah, she's impressive, isn't she?
She really is. She really is. Yeah. My friend Shingo Yamagami, who was Japan's last ambassador to Australia, has been an advisor to her leading up to her becoming the Prime Minister. Wow. After he's no longer in public life, so he went back to Japan and wrote a book about China's wolf warrior diplomacy, which
Yeah.
shot's #1 on the Amazon Japan list.
Actually, I'd love you to connect us so I can get him on my show.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd love. I'm sure
Give
he'd
his
love
book
to.
a big plug.
And then we had Beijing's man in Tokyo. I don't call them ambassadors and I don't call them embassies because they're not. It's a very different operating system. They're the CCP's reps. So he comes out and basically threatens to behead, if you don't mind, Japan's new prime minister. I mean, outrageous behavior. He should be put on the first plane back to Beijing, sent packing. But Japan is integral. Australia's integral. South Korea is important. If we work together, we present significant deterrence
Absolutely.
for Xi to take action on Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan is a democracy, and I love Taiwan. And great people. You know, it's got a free media. Beijing's trying to undermine the president. He's trying to influence the Kuomintang or the KMT to try and, you know, create that sort of grey zone of subversive activity and so on. So it's never a dull moment. I'm reading stuff till 11 o'clock every day, and I can't keep up with it, you know, and it's all I do. So
yeah, look, and this is why you're able to answer my questions in the way in which you do, because you are just all over this, which I love. You mentioned the word deterrent. I want to talk about AUKUS. There was a lot of doubt initially under this new Trump administration, and people call him an isolationist, et cetera, et cetera. I look at it differently. I think he's absolutely America first, of course, but he understands that that doesn't mean America only, but he wants other nations to lift their weight as well and to contribute significantly if they're going to benefit from the alliance with the US. AUKUS was a little bit touch and go, but seems to have been very much now reaffirmed as a priority for the Americans as well, post Anthony Albanese's meeting with Donald Trump. What is your take on where AUKUS sits at the moment, and what is that alliance capable of course, America, the UK, and the United and Australia when it comes to the deterrence of China?
yeah, so there's two pillars, and one of them has nothing to do with submarines. It's all the other technologies.
Yeah.
And from what I hear, that's progressing really well. You know, you don't build a nuclear-powered Virginia-class submarine over a weekend. And, you know, the
Chinese probably are with their work ethic.
Not even them. Well, this is one of the few areas where the US has a generational technological advantage. And that's why Beijing is so anti-AUKUS, because these things, they disappear in the deep waters of the Pacific and nobody knows where they are. And one of those things can ruin your day, you know, so they're the pointy end of the spear in terms of deterrence. And I think it's fantastic news for Australia. Credit to ScoMo and his team, our previous Prime Minister, on this initiative, because it suits Australia's needs. There's a mentality in Australia that you can have smaller submarines doing laps of the country, circumnavigating our coastline to defend our shores. 90-something% of our trade is seaborne, and it goes through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. So you don't have to invade Australia to bring us to our knees. All you have to do is have a blockade of maritime activity. Now, having that deterrence in the Big Blue Pacific helps keep China kind of behind its first and second island chain. So I'm massively in favour of AUKUS. Is it hard? Yeah, sure it's hard. Yeah. Does Australia have the capacity right now in terms of nuclear engineering and so on? No, but we're working on it and we're making great progress. So I'm all for it. We also, out of the Asian summits, we heard that South Korea wants access to this technology. I think that makes sense as well, because they're a big shipbuilder. So when we work together, we're able to do more. I think Hyundai invested in the Philly shipyard and so on. So Team Freedom, we got to get together. We got to get cracking, keep the Indo-Pacific open and free.
Absolutely. The more, the merrier. I want to now shift a tiny bit. I say away from kind of national security and military, but it is also so related, isn't it? You can't separate anything from anything really in this day and age. But talk about the drugs. Talk about the elements that come out of China that directly impact, particularly in the US, and how they benefit from essentially this flooding in of all these awful things that kill so many people on the ground.
Yeah. Well, this is a huge, and just let me pull a couple of books off my shelf.
Please.
Right, so there's your dad's one there.
For all those watching, it's called Danger on Our Doorstep. And it's an incredible book. And all the profits donated to charities. We don't make a cent from it, but it's a brilliant book. Elbridge Colby came out, the man we were talking about a little bit earlier, and said that it's spot on the way that Dad has predicted this will all play out. So bless you.
And here it is. To Philo from Jim. Much appreciated. I had a bunch of great long discussions with your dad, and a great Australian, a gentleman, a scholar, and a warrior. And we all. So yeah, China has a strategy. TikTok's part of it to undermine the US from within. And there's
Absolutely.
also a doctrine called, this is a very important book written by two senior PLA guys in the late 90s. I get in trouble for holding books up on
That's fine.
sometimes. And I'm like, yeah, I read a lot. So, you know,
Yeah.
I'm not ashamed of that. And I'm
Love
not
that.
ashamed of plugging people that have done really good work as well, because it's never been about me. It's about building a community of
Yeah.
like-minded people and rising
Absolutely.
together. So on the drugs, there was a great article I highly recommend in the Washington Post just this week on meth and how that's spreading all over Asia. All the precursors come from China. Of
Yeah.
course, the other area is fentanyl. Once again, all the precursors come from China. I'm close to Steve Yates at Heritage. He lost his daughter from a fentanyl overdose. Just devastating, you know. And I remember having a chat to Andrew Hastie, one of the ministers here, and he
Could be our future Prime Minister for all those who are not Australian,
I'm
all
a
those
fan.
watching.
So he's a great guy. And, you know, he joined the Australian, the ADF. He became a commando, served in Afghanistan after seeing the Twin Towers go down on 9/11. So I made the point to him that the opioid crisis in North America, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people under 30 die every year. That's roughly 33 9/11s a year. You think of it in that context,
Yes.
it's unrestricted warfare. As far as Beijing's been concerned, we must remember the CCP has a history of working with organized crime to achieve its ends and turning the other way. Example of that, the Yuan Long MRT incident in Hong Kong, where people were returning for the process. All these white-shirted triads with big wooden sticks showed up. There were no police to be found, and they beat the living daylights out of the people. So, you know, dial a triad. They do that when it suits them, which is a real concern. But the drugs, you know, we need to fight back against this. And so Trump is playing hardball on that, as he should. And I have no sympathy for people running drugs from Venezuela.
Absolutely agree. The lowest of the low.
Well, they deserve no mercy, because the amount of carnage they're going to create in society, the amount of heartache and pain they're going to create, the cost to the economy and all of that. So Trump's standing up and protecting American young people. This is a huge problem in Latin America. It's a huge problem in Canada, where the CCP has infiltrated that country 10x worse than it is in Australia. You know, Trudeau Sr. set up diplomatic ties 2 years before we did. They were the first Western country outside the UK to do so. And they've turned a blind eye due to vested interest to such a point that real estate and organised crime, narcos and money launderers have infiltrated Canada so much that this has become a huge issue in US-Canada relations. And the US is saying, come on, Canada, first of all, you need to up your military spend so you're a useful ally, which they haven't been pulling their weight. And you need to get serious about this infiltration and the drugs, because they're coming across the border. So this is part of unrestricted warfare. If it's from their perspective, it's killing young Americans and we're making money. What's not to like, you know?
Yeah.
So it's time to fight back, and the US is doing that and under Trump's leadership.
Last question. I want to tie this into an area that I cover in great detail regularly, and this is looking at the Middle East. This is looking at the Islamic extremism. When you look at where this money comes from, particularly in this online warfare and the propaganda that gets propelled, the universities that are just have been funded by Qatari money to completely destroy America from within. It doesn't get said often enough, but a lot of money comes from the CCP to cause the exact same chaos. They benefit probably more than anyone else from a chaotic, disjointed America in particular. Can you talk to me about what you know about the kind of the role they play in that side of it as well? It's not just the drugs, it's also the minds of young Americans that they are very happy to support the decay of.
Yeah, 100%. This is information warfare. So the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, massively consequential, as we know. They would pale in comparison to a great power war in the Indo-Pacific in scale and consequence.
Yeah.
Having said that, China's interest is to distract the United States.
Yeah.
So it's the guarantor, if you like, of Putin's invasion and the atrocities in Ukraine. And it's also got a similar role in backing the regime in Tehran, which of course is the sponsor of Hamas, Hezbollah, along with the Qataris, Hezbollah, and the Yemenis, the Houthis as well. And so it's they like to poison the minds of the under 30 mob who are on TikTok, who don't watch the evening news, who don't really read. And so, you know, the Free Palestine thing has become like a fashion icon, the cause du jour. even though a lot of these young people don't know what they're talking about.
Absolutely no idea.
And so, yeah, this is information warfare. And there's also, China has been buying Russia's oil, keeping the petro economy alive, while at the same time it's been shipping a lot of its excess manufacturing. China makes, for example, 2x the number of EVs that it can absorb domestically. So it's dumping them all around the world, Russia more than anywhere else. Even the Russians now are unhappy about that. And in the Middle East, China is, to my Israeli friends and my Jewish friends, PRC Inc. is not your friend.
Yeah.
I can tell you that right now. They had an interest in Israel because of its technology, but they see Israel as being joined at the hip as a US ally and also part of Western culture. For me, from my perspective, Christians and Jews are a different branch of the same tree. It's Western culture at its roots, and so the Judeo-Christian tradition. So they see it from that perspective as well. They've given Israel no support since October 7/23. And, if you look at, for example, a big influencer of BYD in China was spewing all these anti-Semitic tropes online. So that's become fashionable in China now, to these sort of anti-Semitic attacks in social media. And as you know, China is a surveillance and censorship state. So that stuff is allowed. They turn a blind eye to it.
Of course they do. Yeah. Andrew Phelan, you are brilliant. Thank you so much for helping my audience understand a situation that does not get anywhere near enough exposure. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll get you back on the show soon.
It's a mission, Erin. It's the hill I'm going to die on, for better or worse. Keep up the great work. Great to be with you.
Bless you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Erin.